trying to think of the best way to put this. When you joined the Women's Army Corps, how did that happen? How did that come about?
Long story, maybe I can shorten it a little bit, but again, the radio programs were kind of few and far between, but we had read in the Lexington paper, and I say we, I'm now talking about teachers at Versailles High School, and we were in the teachers' lounge for a break, and all commenting that we'd heard that Congress had just approved in mid-May 1942 having a group of women known as Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, later became the Women's Army Corps, to serve, similar to what the British were doing, who had been in combat for at least 3 years at that point in time. And so we decided it might be interesting to apply and see if any of us would be accepted, because you had to apply, whether you wanted to be an enlisted or whether you wanted to go for a commission. You still would have to go to school to be a commission. It wouldn't be a direct commission as such. We only had one person in the whole WAC that was a direct commission, and that was Evita Culp Hobby, who was the director of the Women's Army Corps, and she was a direct appointment. Came in because she had political connections, but she knew her way around on various things. Her husband had been former governor of Texas. She was a journalist. She was active in state government in Texas. But she was the only direct commission. So everybody else, even though people were trying to pull rank, so to speak, and get appointments for their person to go ahead and be commissioned, the Army refused to do it, and everyone had to go through. Now, nurses coming in did not have to go through officer training. They were being commissioned directly as a second lieutenant. They were a commissioned officer rather than a non-commissioned officer coming in. So the three of us borrowed a car. Versailles is only 13 miles from Lexington, but we didn't have access to a car. Of course, we're poor teachers starting out. And so we bummed a car and had to come to the nearest federal building, which was located in Lexington, in order to get the application forms and information on applying. And we had only a 2-week window in which to do that. So we hustled along. We all three filled out the applications. And I went on then to summer school, because I had started the previous summer in graduate school at the University of Wisconsin in home ec education, realizing if I was going to go on in teaching and so on, that a master's degree in Wisconsin was an extremely strong school in that area. So I felt very fortunate, but I was ready to go for my second summer session to Wisconsin. I got word just before I left, while I was still teaching, that I had been accepted for the application for the Women's Army Corps. Now, in order to do that, I had been through 3 different processes. We had to have a physical, and that's where you're Fort Thomas. One of you, I believe, Fort Thomas. Well, that was an active military base.
Right.
That's the place where they asked you where you were from, and then before you had a chance to say, they'd say, "Oh, well, we know you're Kentucky," because I would say, when they say jump on one foot 10 times, jump on the other foot 10 times, I would say right or left foot. And they said, "You have to be from Kentucky." Because then I would have asked, with shoes on or shoes off, you know. In other words, the directions were hazy, just jump, you know. So we always laughed about Fort Thomas and the lack of exacting directors. So you had your physical. If you passed that, then you'd have the mental test. And the mental test was in Louisville, where we left at. So if you passed those 2, then you had a personal interview. And those of us from Kentucky were sent to Columbus, Ohio, which was the headquarters of our service command. The United States was divided into 9 or 11, 13 service commands, and we fell in the one under the jurisdiction out of Fort Hays at Columbus, Ohio. And if you passed the interview, you were in. Now, interesting thing happened on the interview, because I knew which cubicle I was going to be assigned. They'd already told me. I was going down to cubicle 9, for instance. And I looked to see who were the interviewers. And lo and behold, I knew one of them. Dean Sarah Blanding had been Dean of Women at the University of Kentucky, and I had worked strongly with her when I'd been the university's president of the students at UK, the women's students. So I sent word to the information desk. You'd think I was trying to get out of it or something, but that I actually knew Dean Dean Blanding, and perhaps they might want to consider shooting me into another interview unit, you know. And so they apparently asked Dean Blanding, and she shot back the words, "There are 3 of us on the committee, and the other 2, if they don't care for her, they can override me in voting." So I went ahead, and the other 2, one was a career Army person, and the other was a professional business person. Both happened to be males. And Dean Blanding went on and became president of, or she at the time actually had already moved. She was president of Vassar University. She left the University of Kentucky and become president of Vassar. So those were the 3 interviews that you had.
What questions did they ask you?
I have no idea what they asked me. I just remember when I came home and told my parents, came home on the weekend, and here I lived in Lexington actually, and I told my mother at the dinner table, those are the days when you ate dinner with your family every night and you talked about everything good and all the things not so good that happened during the day. So I told her that I had applied for the Women's Army Corps. And my mother jumped up out of the chair screaming, "You'll be killed, you'll be killed," and so on. I have no idea what my dad did because he was so busy trying to calm my mother down. And as I look back on it, very rightfully so, this was 1942. We'd had the war since the beginning of December the 7th, 1941. And my mom had friends here in Lexington, 2 of whom had already had their sons killed in combat. So this was a very real thing. I mean, joining the military was serious business. And so the tragedies were there. I will say that as time went on, my mother became quite a supporter of having women in the military, and the governor appointed her to the state committee of women to represent the recruiting for women in Kentucky to join the WAC. And she joined it and was quite active in it and so on. So once she got accustomed to the idea, she would point out the values and the pitfalls of perhaps going into this brand new thing that we'd never had here, officially, a women's unit.
So what was your kind of inspiration to join the Women's Army Corps? Was it just this like willingness to serve, or was it a way to like progress yourself?
As I said, I was the summer of 1942, I was a student in graduate work at the University of Wisconsin. And as always happens on lots of these cases, I'd met a young man who was a Wisconsin person in med school. And we always had great conversations and so forth. So it was a great problem when I got 2 telegrams in one day. Telegrams were the way of communication. You didn't have cell phones. You couldn't pick up the telephone and text somebody or something. They were the yellow printed out telegrams. And I got 2 in one day. And one of them said, "You've been accepted for the Women's Army Corps." This is June 1942. "You've been accepted to join it, and you are to report August 1st. The other one said, "You've been granted a graduate assistantship at Northwestern University, and you are to report such and such." I was changing my major from home ec education. I was shifting to college administration and personnel. And at that time, Northwestern was one of about 3 strong schools in that area of endeavor. And so I was quite flattered and pleased to have been accepted. So I had the decision, because I'd already been offered and had signed a contract actually to return to teach at Versailles for the fall of 42. So I had 3 things to decide. And my friend was a great listener and so on. He was in med school, had another year to go or 2. And had already, in order to stay in school, had signed for the Navy. And if you signed for the military branch, they often would allow you to finish your engineering courses or your medical courses, which the military could use you as a trained person for. So that was my big decision, and obviously the decision was everybody's going to be doing something. This is an all-out war. Children are going to be doing something. They're going to be collecting foil. They're going to be up and down the streets. Rationing was already in effect. people were doing without silk. Well, they didn't have silk hose. They were primarily rayon hose. You know, you don't remember, but your great-grandparents would, that mothers would remember there was a seam up the back of the stocking. That's where the rayon was sewn together for the hose. It wasn't just a tube as such. Well, when you couldn't buy, and you're a college student, and you can't buy something to cover your legs that's, that is available, no hose, pantyhose hadn't really come in at that point. It was all garter hose. You had a pen, like for your eyebrow pen, and you'd take that and you'd line up the back of your leg so you'd have your seam showing. And it would look like, and so you use the tanning lotion, and then you'd have the seam up the back of your leg well, that was a big thing, you know. I remember after the war, always saying to people, so on, just be sure when I get old that one of you tell me if my seams are straight on my hose. Because to me, older women often would have the baggy hose. They couldn't get them pulled up right. It was the type of fabric that we had at that point, which was super, but it wasn't like it is now, and easy. And so your hose would be wrinkled. So that was my experience on having to decide, because, as I say, everybody else was going to be doing something. I might as well gamble for the unknown, and it had interest and appeal to me.
Do you think your attitude towards the war was different than maybe some of the other teachers that you worked with, other women who did not apply?
Yeah, women are all different in what they like, what their interest. Some are a little more daring. I kind of believe if you don't take a risk, you haven't gained anything. You know, I mean, it may fall flat, but at least you've given it a go. And I don't think all women had that attitude. And not all women really adapted it. But the same thing I think is true of men. A lot of men don't adapt to the group living and the routine. It's very difficult when you've been used to making your own calls and somebody's telling you exactly what you're going to do at 2 o'clock that afternoon and where you're going to be at 5:47 and a half that later that afternoon on the parade field or whatever it is, because somebody else is controlling your activities. Just as a side, I think that's one of the problems right now when people get out of the military. They have been so acclimated to someone telling them where they need to be at what time and what you're going to do, that the readjustment back to the civilian life becomes quite a stressful activity. I mean, I don't think it's any different now than it was back then. People had difficulties in adjusting, and I think that's one of the reasons.
So you reported August 1st, 1942?
I reported August 1st, 1942, and there were 11 of us in our group. We were assigned to the second officer candidate class. From the original pool of interviews, they had created about 4 classes of women. The first class had started mid-July, and we were starting later, but we were all selected at the same time, which class and when we would report. So mine was, and we went through the Cincinnati recruiting office to go into it. So we became part of what you call the 5th Service Command. And the number that I was assigned for the military started with the number 5. So you could look at any of the WAC women and you could tell what area of the country they were inducted by the first number of their identifying code.
So, August 1st, 1942, what were some of the other women like, the other 11 women in your unit?
Very, very capable. I just found myself amazed that I had the opportunity to be with such an outstanding group. Granted, see, when I applied, I hit just the minimum age, 21. So I thought I was an out to start with. And then meeting all these women, because most of them had been careers. They had been CEOs of businesses. They had had strong leadership in their career, and most of them were older. Our oldest, I think, was 35, which was about the top on age. Her husband was a full colonel at Fort Knox, and they had no children. And so we all called her, since she was our class, we called her Mama Matuska, her last name Matuska. So she was like a mama to us because she was old. She was 35 along the way. Right.
Could you tell in a difference of attitude between the Women's Army Corps, all these women who volunteered, and the men who were drafted? What was a difference in attitude maybe between these two groups?
Well, I bet you could jump to that conclusion right off.
Yeah.
The very first thing is, what man wanted some woman to come in and take his place so he had to go fight in combat? So you might not be the most popular person showing up on the scene, because the object of the women in the military was to replace a man for active duty. So that meant the women were coming in to be trained for all these jobs that women could do, as well as men. But you see, the men were accustomed to being they were the secretaries. They kept the minutes. They did a lot of things that we sometimes thought of as more a female occupation. The telephone operators, the women could take over all the telephone operators. They learned truck repair, maintenance. I mean, they're just anything, lots of things that they could do. So that, I would say, for a lot of men, that was very alarming. I think we would all find that if your jobs are threatened, I don't know that it would hang over into other areas, whether it's race coming in, or whether it's your age, or whether it's your gender, just what.